Can I sleep with you tonight, human? The alien princess entered my room in the middle of the night. The diplomatic vessel Harmony hung in the void like a silver needle, threading invisible fabric between human and Valian territories. Inside cabin 247C, Miles Kensington was dreaming about paperwork when the soft hiss of his door woke him. His hand shot toward the light panel, his heart doing that stupid thing where it tried to escape through his ribcage. In his line of work, people didn't visit at 3 in the morning unless something had gone spectacularly wrong. He'd been a diplomatic attaché long enough to know that spectacularly wrong usually involved at least one explosion and several strongly worded letters. The door revealed Princess Alara of Valia. Miles blinked, then blinked again, because apparently his brain needed a moment to process why alien royalty was standing in his doorway, wearing what appeared to be a nightgown, in an expression of barely contained panic. Her pale violet skin caught the ambient light from the corridor, giving her an ethereal quality that would have been stunning if Miles wasn't busy wondering whether this was a diplomatic incident, a security breach, or possibly both. Her silver hair fell past her shoulders in uncombed waves, and her long pointed ears drooped slightly in a way he'd learned meant exhaustion or distress. Nothing about her posture suggested the composed princess who'd spent the last 6 hours negotiating mining rights with the patience of a saint and the precision of a lawyer. Princess? Miles sat up, trying to sound professional while wearing pajamas decorated with tiny spaceships. His ex-fiancée had bought them as a joke. The joke was apparently on him. Is something wrong? Should I call security? Ambassador Whitmore? The intergalactic emergency hotline that probably doesn't exist but really should. Alara stepped inside and let the door close behind her. She stood there trembling slightly, her hands twisting the fabric of her nightgown. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Can I sleep with you tonight, human? Miles's mind went through approximately 17 different protocol scenarios in the span of 2 seconds. None of them covered this. His diplomatic training had prepared him for trade disputes, cultural misunderstandings, and even the proper way to decline poisonous ceremonial beverages. Nowhere in the manual was there a chapter titled, What to Do When Alien Princesses Request Sleepovers. That sounds like something that could end my career and possibly start an interstellar incident? He tried to make it sound diplomatic. It came out strangled. The nightmares, Alara said, and her composure cracked like glass. Every night since the attack on my home station, I can't be alone anymore. Miles saw the tears then, tracking down her violet cheeks. He remembered the briefing about the bombing 2 months ago, the royal residence on Station Valara 9, 37 dead. The princess had been there, had survived by what analysts called remarkable luck, and what Miles suspected was probably something more traumatic than luck. My guards see a princess, she continued. My attendants see their duty. The High Council sees a political asset. No one sees that I'm terrified. Well, hell. Miles understood something about being terrified. He joined the diplomatic corps specifically because it seemed safer than military service. And look how that was working out. Princess, if anyone finds out you were here, I know the risk. She met his eyes, and there was steel beneath the vulnerability. I know what I'm asking, but during the negotiations, you're the only one who doesn't treat me like I'm made of glass. You argued with me about the Kishra mining contracts. You made that terrible joke about asteroid depreciation. It was a good joke, Miles protested weakly. It was awful, but you treated me like a person, not a tragedy. She took a breath. It's just sleeping. I just need to not be alone. Please. Miles made a decision that he was fairly certain would look terrible in his performance review. He moved over on the narrow bed, which was designed for one person and would be cozy for two in a way that would definitely require explanation if discovered. The bed's big enough, he lied, but if Security Chief Ramos finds out, I'm blaming you entirely. Relief flooded Alara's features. She climbed onto the far side of the bed, maintaining a careful distance of approximately 6 inches, which in diplomatic terms might as well have been a demilitarized zone. They lay there in silence, both staring at the ceiling where a porthole showed distant stars. Miles? Her voice was small in the darkness. Yes? Can you just talk? About anything. I need to hear another voice. So Miles talked. He told her about Earth's coffee culture and how the diplomatic lounge served something that insulted the very concept of coffee. He described his hometown, a small city where the most exciting thing to happen in 20 years was when someone's cat got elected mayor as a protest vote. He explained the rules of baseball, which made no sense even to humans. He shared the story of how he'd once accidentally insulted a Centauri ambassador by complimenting their hat, which turned out to be their spouse. Somewhere around his explanation of why humans found small dogs inherently hilarious, Elara's breathing slowed and evened. Princess Elara of Valia fell asleep for the first time in weeks, finally feeling safe. Miles stayed awake much longer, staring at the ceiling and knowing that everything had just gotten significantly more complicated. Elara slipped out of Miles's quarters at 0547 hours, which he knew precisely because he'd been awake checking his wrist comm every 3 minutes like a paranoid spy in a bad holovid. She paused at the door, her long ears perking up slightly as she turned back. "Thank you," she said, and the warmth in her voice made Miles realize just how isolated she must have been. Then she was gone, leaving him alone with the growing certainty that he'd made either the best or worst decision of his diplomatic career. Possibly both. He dragged himself to the shower and spent 20 minutes underwater that was never quite the right temperature, courtesy of the Harmony's environmental systems. The ship was a joint construction project, which meant it had human plumbing, Valian atmospheric controls, and the perpetual compromise of nobody being entirely comfortable. Miles had once joked that diplomatic vessels were designed to make everyone equally miserable as a form of team building. The morning briefing was held in Conference Room B, which had a viewport showing the Keshra asteroid belt. Chunks of rock drifted past, each one representing enough mineral wealth to fund a small colony or start a medium-sized war. Ambassador Whitmore stood at the head of the table, his impressive gut preceding him like a personal herald. "Gentlemen, lady, various honored guests," Whitmore began, somehow making even basic greetings sound condescending. "Today we tackle the critical issue of mining extraction percentages. I propose we begin with a firm stance that—" "With respect, Ambassador," Miles interrupted, already regretting it, "perhaps we should hear the Velian position before establishing our firm stance." Whitmore's face did something complicated. Across the table, Elara's expression remained perfectly neutral, but Miles caught the microscopic twitch at the corner of her mouth. She looked flawless in her formal robes, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that probably took her attendance an hour. Nothing about her suggested she'd spent the night in his quarters, having nightmares about explosions. Counselor Theris, the senior Valian negotiator, had skin a deeper purple than Elara's, and ears that curved backward like scythes. He spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd memorized the insult potential of every word. "The Valian Concordat maintains that extraction rights should reflect historical presence in the sector. Human corporations arrived 3 years ago. We have maintained stations here for 2 generations." "Historical presence," Whitmore scoffed. "You had a listening post and a fuel depot. We have actual mining infrastructure." Miles watched the conversation spiral toward familiar territory. They'd been having the same argument for 3 weeks, just with different adjectives. He pulled up data on his tablet, numbers he'd been reviewing until his eyes crossed. There had to be a compromise somewhere in the mathematics. "What if," Miles said, surprising himself, "we structured extraction percentages based on investment rather than presence? Both sides contribute resources, both sides benefit proportionally. We establish a joint development corporation with Attaché Kensington." Whitmore's voice could have frozen helium. "Your role is to take notes, not to negotiate." Elara straightened slightly. "Actually, I find Attaché Kensington's suggestion intriguing. The framework could address both our concerns about equitable resource distribution." She launched into an expansion of Miles's half-formed idea, adding Valian legal structures and human corporate models in a way that somehow made sense. Miles watched her work, impressed despite himself. She was taking his scraps and building cathedrals. The rest of the meeting passed in technical discussion that was either brilliant compromise or elaborate mutual confusion. Miles couldn't quite tell which, but at least nobody had threatened to walk out, which counted as progress. During the recess, Security Chief Ramos materialized at Miles's elbow, like a particularly suspicious ghost. The man had shoulders that suggested he'd been constructed rather than born, and eyes that suggested he trusted nobody. Kensington, interesting contributions today. Thank you, Chief. Wasn't a compliment, just an observation. Ramos leaned against the wall, casual in a way that felt calculated. You seem close with the Valian delegation. Building bridges, maintaining diplomatic relations, that sort of thing. Miles felt sweat form places sweat had no business forming. Just doing my job, Chief. Right, your job. Ramos smiled without warmth. Funny thing about ship sensors, they track everything. Environmental fluctuations, pressure changes, door cycles. Fascinating data if you know how to read it. He walked away before Miles could formulate a response that wasn't a confession. That evening's reception was held in the observation lounge, where the great and the diplomatic gathered to drink mediocre wine and pretend they liked each other. Miles nursed something that claimed to be champagne and watched Alara navigate a conversation with three Valian nobles who were clearly angling for political advantage through marriage proposals. The Theros family would be honored, one said, his ears practically vibrating with enthusiasm. House Valora has maintained close ties with the royal line for centuries, another countered. Ilara smiled with her mouth but not her eyes. Gentlemen, I'm focused entirely on the success of these negotiations. Personal matters can wait. Her gaze found Miles across the room, just for a moment. Something passed between them, an understanding that had nothing to do with mining rights or treaties. Later, much later, when most of the ship had retired and the corridor lights had dimmed to night cycle, Miles heard the familiar hiss of his door. Alara stood there with a bottle of Valian wine and a tentative smile. I thought we could make this less awkward if we actually talked first, she said. Miles stepped aside. Does that wine actually taste good, or is it one of those diplomatic things where we pretend? It's terrible, Alara admitted, coming inside, but it's traditional, which somehow makes it worse. They talked until the ship's dawn cycle began, sharing stories that had nothing to do with treaties or politics. Miles learned that Alara had wanted to be an engineer before duty demanded otherwise. She learned that Miles had joined the diplomatic corps partly to disappoint his military father. Somewhere in those hours, they stopped being princess and attaché and became simply two people who'd found something unexpected in the darkness between stars. 3 weeks into what Miles privately called Operation Diplomatic Sleepover, he'd developed a working theory that the universe had a sense of humor, and that sense of humor was terrible. The nocturnal visits had become routine. Alara would appear around midnight, they'd talk until she fell asleep, and she'd leave before dawn. During the day, they maintained perfect professional distance except for the occasional shared glance when Ambassador Whitmore said something particularly obtuse, which happened approximately every 11 minutes. Miles had started timing it. The fundamental issue, Whitmore announced during the morning session, is that Valians simply don't understand free market economics. Ilara's left ear twitched. Miles coughed to cover a laugh. Counselor Theros looked like he was contemplating murder, or possibly a strongly worded diplomatic note, which in his culture might be the same thing. What surprised Miles was how much Alara carried. She'd explained it during one of their late-night conversations, how Valian culture viewed emotional expression as weakness. After the bombing that killed her younger brother, she'd been expected to appear at his funeral with perfect composure, to give speeches about unity and strength while her world shattered. No tears, no rage. No acknowledgement that she was anything other than a symbol. Your people have grief counselors, yes? She'd asked one night, her voice soft in the darkness. Entire professions dedicated to it, Miles had confirmed. Therapists, support groups, licensed professionals who help people process trauma. We have duty, Alara had said simply. It's considered sufficient. Miles had decided then that Valian culture had some significant blind spots. The breakthrough came during a particularly tedious session about refining percentages. Miles had been doodling mathematical models on his tablet, barely paying attention, when something clicked. He scribbled faster, numbers arranging themselves into patterns. What if we staggered extraction rates based on seasonal orbital mechanics? he blurted out, interrupting Whitmore mid-sentence. The asteroids follow predictable patterns. Human operations are more efficient during the Keshra belt's perihelion, Valian operations during aphelion, due to different technology approaches. We split the year, maximize both efficiencies, increase total yield. The room went silent. Whitmore looked apoplectic. Counselor Theris looked intrigued. Elara looked at her own tablet, her fingers flying across the display. The orbital mechanics support this, she said slowly. If we coordinate extraction schedules with natural resource accessibility, we could increase efficiency by 17%. Neither side loses, both sides gain. She looked up, meeting Miles's eyes. This could actually work. What followed was 3 hours of the most productive negotiation the mission had seen. Miles and Elara built frameworks while their superiors took credit, but neither of them cared. They'd cracked something fundamental, proven that cooperation beat competition. During the lunch recess, they ended up in the same corridor. Elara's attendants were at a discreet distance, far enough for privacy but close enough to maintain propriety. That was inspired, she said quietly. That was desperation and too much coffee, Miles corrected, but I'll take the win. Tonight, Elara began, then paused. There's a memory I need to tell someone about. My brother, the day before the bombing. Would you? Of course. Her smile was worth every risk, but risks accumulated. That afternoon, Counselor Theris cornered Miles in the observation deck. The older Valian studied him with eyes that missed nothing. You have influence with the princess, Theris said, not a question. I serve the diplomatic mission, Miles replied carefully. Yes, but she listens to you, changes negotiating positions based on your suggestions. This is unusual. Theris's ears tilted forward. A gesture Miles had learned meant suspicion. The princess should be guided by Valian interests, not human influence. With respect, Counselor, the princess guides herself. I just occasionally contribute ideas that she makes actually functional. See that your ideas remain focused on negotiations, attaché. The princess has responsibilities beyond treaty discussions. The warning was clear enough. Miles nodded and escaped before Theris could elaborate. That evening, Security Chief Ramos delivered his own message by pulling Miles aside after dinner. Ambassador wants to see you. Now. Whitmore's office smelled like expensive tobacco and cheaper ambition. The ambassador sat behind his desk like a judge preparing to deliver sentence. Kensington, you're here to support, not innovate. Your job is background work, not main stage performances. I was just trying to help the negotiations. You were trying to make yourself important, Whitmore snapped, getting cozy with the Valians, proposing solutions above your pay grade. It looks bad, makes people wonder about your loyalties. Miles felt his jaw tighten. My loyalty is to successful diplomacy, sir. Your loyalty is to human interests and my authority. Remember that, or I'll find an attaché who can. Miles left fuming, which was probably why he didn't notice the maintenance alert for Section 2D until later, the section that included the tour route Elara would walk the next day. That night, Elara arrived with red-rimmed eyes and talked about her brother, how he'd wanted to be a pilot, how he'd made her laugh the day before the bombing by doing terrible impressions of Counselor Theris, how she'd held his hand while he died in the rubble, whispering promises she couldn't keep about everything being fine. Miles held her while she cried, and somewhere in those hours, something shifted between them. A line crossed without acknowledgement, a friendship becoming something neither of them had names for yet. The next morning, Miles reviewed the maintenance logs because insomnia and paranoia made strange bedfellows. His blood went cold when he saw the airlock service schedule for Section 2D. The seal integrity tests had been overridden, manually, recently. He ran for the control center, his heart hammering. Elara was scheduled to tour that section in 20 minutes. He burst into the operations room, breathless and probably looking insane. Shut down Section 2D, airlock compromise, now! Chief Engineer Morrison looked up from her console, annoyed. Excuse me? The seal integrity on airlock D7 is compromised. Princess Elara is scheduled to tour that section. If someone cycles that airlock, Morrison's expression changed. Her fingers flew across controls. Security to Section 2D. Halt the royal tour. Lock down that sector. The automated response came back cold and mechanical. Airlock D7 cycle initiated. Decompression in 90 seconds. Miles watched the timer count down while Morrison screamed orders and security scrambled. Somewhere in the ship, Ilara was walking toward a door that would open onto vacuum. The timer hit 0 and nothing happened, which Miles decided was the best kind of nothing he'd ever experienced. Security override successful, Morrison announced, sagging against her console. Tour group stopped 3 meters from the airlock. Princess is safe. Miles discovered that his legs had stopped working properly. He sat down hard on the floor of the operations room, which was undignified but beat the alternative of fainting like a character in a Victorian novel. Kensington, Morrison said, looking down at him with something between respect and concern. How the hell did you know? Couldn't sleep, read maintenance logs, impossibly developing a stress disorder. Miles managed to stand, though his hands were shaking. Who initiated that cycle? Working on it. Morrison's fingers danced across her displays. Override came from a maintenance terminal in Section 3B. Ghost login, but we'll trace it. The investigation that followed made the next 3 days a special kind of hell. Security Chief Ramos interviewed everyone, including Miles, who had to explain his midnight paranoia about maintenance logs without mentioning why he'd been awake at that particular hour. He went with chronic insomnia and compulsive document review, which was technically true and made him sound boring enough to be believable. The bomber turned out to be a maintenance tech named Davies, a thin, nervous man who cracked during his second interrogation and confessed to being part of something called the Humanity First movement. He'd been paid to send a message about humans who got too comfortable with alien influence. Ambassador Whitmore wanted to bury it. Counselor Theris wanted blood. The diplomatic mission teetered on the edge of collapse, while both sides argued about responsibility, accountability, and whose security protocols had failed more spectacularly. Miles found Ilara on the observation deck at 0200 hours, staring at the stars like they held answers. She wasn't in his quarters, hadn't been for 3 nights, and Miles understood, but hated it anyway. You should be sleeping, he said quietly, approaching slowly. So should you. She didn't turn around. They tell me you saved my life. The investigation reports say you noticed the maintenance discrepancy. I got lucky and paranoid. Thank you for being paranoid. Her voice cracked slightly. I keep thinking about how close it was. 3 more meters and I would have been in the decompression zone when that door opened. My guards, my attendants, everyone near me. Miles stood beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but not quite touching. But you weren't. Davies is in custody. Security protocols are being updated. It's over. It's not over. Ilara finally looked at him, and her eyes were haunted. Don't you see? This is what I've been running from every night when I came to your quarters. This exact feeling. The bombing at home, watching people die, knowing it could happen again at any moment. She turned back to the viewport, her shoulders rigid. My brother was 12. He loved starship models and terrible jokes. The day before the bombing, he convinced me to sneak away from our tutors and explore the maintenance tunnels. We got lost for 3 hours. Our mother was furious. Her voice dropped to a whisper. The next day, the first bomb went off in the East Wing. I was giving a speech about youth education initiatives. I heard the explosion, and I just knew he was there. I ran. Miles waited, giving her space to continue. I found him in the rubble. A beam had fallen across his legs. He was conscious, trying to be brave. He told me one of his stupid jokes while I tried to lift the beam. Something about a Valiant and a human walking into a bar. She laughed, but it came out broken. I was still trying to get him free when the second bomb went off. The ceiling came down. When I woke up, they told me 37 people were dead. My brother was among them. Ilara? They wouldn't let me grieve, she continued, the words pouring out now. Not publicly. The princess had to be strong, composed, a symbol of resilience. I gave speeches at memorials with a smile. I attended my brother's funeral and didn't cry because crying would show weakness. And every night since then, I see him in my dreams, telling that joke, dying while I fail to save him. Miles did touch her then, his hand finding hers. You're not failing. You survived. You're here, trying to build peace from the wreckage. That matters. Does it? She squeezed his hand. A human tried to kill me because I'm working toward peace. How many others feel the same? How many on both sides would rather see this mission fail? Probably depressing numbers of them, Miles admitted. But that's why we keep going. Because the alternative is more bombings, more dead children, more people telling jokes that no one will remember. They stood in silence for a while, watching the asteroids drift past. Finally, Alara spoke again. I can't come to your quarters anymore. Ramos knows. Theris suspects. If word gets out that the Valian princess is spending nights with a human diplomatic attaché, it will destroy everything we've built. I know, but I don't know how to sleep without... She stopped, frustrated. This is ridiculous. I'm royalty. I should be able to handle nightmares without running to a human who makes terrible puns about mining rights. They're excellent puns, Miles protested, and there's no shame in needing help. Your culture might think emotional support is weakness, but my culture invented an entire industry around the idea that everyone needs someone to talk to. We're just better at admitting it. Ilara smiled despite herself. Your culture also invented cheese that comes in aerosol cans. We contain multitudes. She laughed, a real laugh this time, and some of the tension left her shoulders. They stayed on the observation deck until dawn cycle, talking about nothing important. Two people finding comfort in the space between stars. The joint statement was Miles's idea, which meant it was probably going to get him fired. But at this point, his career trajectory resembled a controlled descent into a black hole anyway. We should address the assassination attempt directly, he said during an emergency meeting of the human delegation. Control the narrative before it controls us. Ambassador Whitmore looked at him like he'd suggested they all strip naked and sing show tunes. Attaché Kensington, we've discussed your tendency to exceed your authority. With respect, sir, doing nothing is also a choice, and it's the wrong one. What followed was 6 hours of arguments, compromise, and Miles quietly passing notes to Alara through carefully orchestrated bathroom breaks that would have been comedic if the stakes weren't so high. By midnight, they had a draft that combined human directness with Valian philosophical eloquence, which meant it would probably offend everyone equally. They recorded it in Conference Room B at 0300 hours because drama required poor sleep schedules. Alara wore formal robes that made her look every inch the princess. Miles wore his dress uniform and hoped the bags under his eyes read as dedicated public servant rather than man experiencing prolonged crisis. People of the Valian Concordat and humanity, Alara began, her voice steady. 3 days ago, someone attempted to use violence to end these peace negotiations. They failed. Not because our security was perfect, but because individuals on both sides refused to accept that violence is inevitable. Miles picked up the thread. The bomber was human. That's not easy to acknowledge, but it's true. He represented a faction that believes different species can't coexist, can't cooperate, can't build something better than fear. We're here to prove them wrong. They alternated sections, a conversation between species that felt more genuine than any formal diplomatic statement Miles had ever read. Alara spoke about her brother, about loss that transcended species boundaries. Miles talked about the choice between building walls or bridges. Together, they made the case that peace was difficult precisely because it mattered. The statement went live on both human and Valian networks at 0600 hours. By 9 a.m., it had been viewed 40 million times. By noon, it had sparked protests, praise, death threats, and marriage proposals. The comments section was a war zone, which Miles decided meant they'd done something right. Ambassador Whitmore summoned him at 1400 hours. Miles went prepared for termination and possibly arrest. You exceeded your authority, Whitmore said without preamble. You made policy decisions above your grade. You collaborated with a foreign princess without authorization. Yes, sir. You also may have saved this entire mission from collapse. Whitmore leaned back in his chair, looking older than usual. The statement is working. Public opinion is shifting. The hawks on both sides are losing ground. Miles waited for the other shoe to drop. In his experience, shoes dropped in pairs. However, Whitmore continued, there are concerns about your relationship with Princess Alara. You're too close, Kensington. It looks inappropriate. It raises questions about whose interests you're serving. I'm serving peace, sir. Same as you. Are you? Whitmore's eyes narrowed. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're serving a pretty alien girl who's gotten under your skin. That's a security risk. That's a compromised agent. That's someone I can't trust. Miles felt anger flash hot in his chest. I've done nothing but my job, sir. If that job happens to involve treating the Valian delegation like people instead of chess pieces, I won't apologize for it. Then perhaps you're in the wrong profession. Whitmore stood. I'm recommending your transfer back to Earth, effective immediately after the summit concludes. Miles left feeling gutted but not surprised. He found Alara in the archive room, surrounded by treaty documents and looking equally miserable. Theris knows, she said without preamble, about the nights I spent in your quarters. He hasn't said anything officially, but he made pointed comments about inappropriate attachments and remembering my duty to my bloodline. Whitmore's transferring me back to Earth. They looked at each other across the table covered in papers that suddenly seemed less important than they had that morning. This is absurd, Alara said. We helped to save these negotiations. We created something that's actually working, and they're punishing us for it. Welcome to institutional politics. The bureaucracy is cruel, but at least it's consistent. Alara laughed despite everything. How do you make jokes at a time like this? It's either jokes or screaming, and screaming is less socially acceptable. Miles sat down across from her. What are we going to do? I don't know. Theris wants me to make a politically advantageous marriage, strengthen alliances, secure support for the peace treaty through family connections. He's been hinting about it for weeks. Romantic. Valian marriages aren't about romance. They're about duty, alliance, strategy. I've known since childhood that I'd eventually marry for political reasons. And what do you want? Alara met his eyes. That's a dangerous question. I specialize in dangerous questions. It's why I'm getting transferred. Before Alara could answer, Miles's tablet buzzed with an urgent message from Morrison. He read it once, then again, his blood going cold. The financial records from Davies's investigation just came through. The Humanity First movement didn't fund the bombing alone. They had outside help. He turned the tablet so Alara could see. Corporate accounts, shell companies, money from both human and Valian sources. Alara scrolled through the data, her expression hardening. These are military contractors, weapons manufacturers, companies that profit from tension between our species. Someone on both sides wants these negotiations to fail, Miles said slowly. The assassination attempt wasn't extremism. It was business. They spent the next hour tracing financial threads, finding connections that painted an ugly picture. Corporations that supplied weapons to border conflicts, politicians who owned stock in defense contractors, a conspiracy that crossed species lines because profit recognized no boundaries. We need to expose this, Alara said finally. That'll make us even more popular with our respective authorities. I don't care. Do you? Miles thought about his transfer orders, about Whitmore's accusations, about the fact that his career was probably over anyway. Not even slightly. Good. Alara smiled, and it wasn't a princess smile. It was something fiercer. Because the summit's closing ceremonies are in 3 days. That's our chance. The announcement came during the formal dinner 2 nights before the closing ceremonies, which meant Counselor Theris had a gift for terrible timing. The Valian Concordat is pleased to announce, Theris said, standing with a wine glass that probably cost more than Miles's annual salary, the betrothal of Princess Alara to Commander Vathan of the 7th Fleet. This union will strengthen our military alliances and demonstrate Valian commitment to security and tradition. Miles watched Alara's face go carefully blank, that practiced diplomatic mask sliding into place. Across the room, Ambassador Whitmore was already calculating political advantages. The Valian delegation applauded politely. The human delegation looked confused but supportive, because that's what diplomats did when they had no idea what was happening. Miles felt something crack in his chest that had nothing to do with politics. Alara excused herself from the dinner within 15 minutes, citing fatigue. Miles waited 20 minutes before following, which was probably 17 minutes too long for subtlety, but 3 minutes better than sprinting after her immediately. He found her in the observation deck, staring at stars that didn't care about diplomatic disasters. Commander Vathan is 47 years old, Alara said without turning around. He's never been married. He collects antique weapons. He finds my interest in engineering frivolous. Her voice was completely flat. Theris chose him specifically because he represents everything traditional. It's a message about my place in the order of things. Are you going to accept? Do I have a choice? She finally looked at him, and Miles saw the princess facade crumbling. If I refuse, I undermine Theris, weaken the peace coalition, prove every critic right about me being too influenced by human thinking. So you sacrifice yourself for politics. Isn't that what we do? Elara laughed bitterly. You're getting transferred. I'm getting married. We both serve the greater good by disappearing quietly. Miles made a decision that was either brave or stupid, and at this point the distinction seemed academic. What if we didn't disappear quietly? The closing ceremonies were held in the main conference hall, with live feeds broadcasting to both human and Valian space. Dignitaries filled seats, cameras captured every angle, and Miles stood backstage with a data tablet and the absolute certainty that he was about to commit career suicide. Elara appeared beside him, wearing ceremonial robes that somehow made her look both regal and terrifying. Last chance to back out, she said. I've already been transferred and you've already been engaged to a man who collects swords. We're past the point of caution. Fair point. The ceremony proceeded normally for 45 minutes. Ambassador Whitmore gave a speech about cooperation. Counselor Theris spoke about honor and tradition. The treaty documents were presented for final signature. Everything was perfect, scripted, boring. Then Elara stepped to the podium off schedule, and Miles watched chaos unfold in real time. Before we conclude, Elara said, her voice carrying across the hall, there's information the people of both our nations deserve to know. Whitmore's face went through several interesting color changes. Theris stood abruptly. Security Chief Ramos reached for his comm. Miles triggered the data upload, sending financial records to every screen in the hall. The assassination attempt against me was not random extremism, Elara continued. It was funded by corporations on both sides who profit from our conflict. Military contractors, weapons manufacturers, politicians with financial stakes in continued tension. Miles stepped up beside her, because if they were destroying their careers, they might as well do it together. We have transaction records, shell company documentation, and communication logs. Some of the people in this room right now took money to undermine peace negotiations. The hall erupted. Delegates shouted. Cameras zoomed. Miles watched 3 different security teams converge on the stage while data scrolled across every display, irrefutable and damning. The treaty we're signing today matters, Elara said over the chaos. Not because it's perfect, but because some people desperately want it to fail. They profit from our fear, our hatred, our inability to trust each other. We're here to tell you that we refuse to be profitable anymore. Security reached them as Miles delivered the final line they'd rehearsed. The complete evidence files are being released to independent journalists on both sides. You can't bury this. It's already out there. What followed was pandemonium. Security escorted them off stage but couldn't decide whether to arrest them or protect them. Whitmore was screaming about insubordination. Theris was demanding Elara's immediate return to Valia. Journalists were having the best day of their careers. Miles and Elara ended up in a secure conference room with approximately 15 different officials arguing about what to do with them. Through the window, Miles could see the news feeds already spreading their revelation across both networks. You've destroyed your career, Whitmore told Miles coldly. You'll never work in diplomacy again. Worth it, Miles said and meant it. Counselor Theris addressed Elara with icy formality. You have brought shame to your house and position. The betrothal to Commander Vathan is cancelled. You are recalled to Valia immediately for disciplinary proceedings. Elara's ears tilted back, defiant. I refuse the recall. I resign my position as Crown Princess. I'm staying with the diplomatic mission as an independent consultant. The room went silent. Miles stared at her. Elara stared back, something fierce and free in her expression. You can't resign, Theris said, incredulous. I just did. I've spent my life being what everyone needed me to be. I've performed grief and duty and perfect composure while dying inside. No more. She turned to Miles. Someone recently told me that asking for help isn't weakness. I'm done pretending I don't need it. The bureaucratic aftermath took weeks. Multiple investigations launched. Several corporate executives resigned. A few politicians from both sides faced criminal charges. The treaty passed with unprecedented public support because nothing unified people like discovering they'd been manipulated by war profiteers. Miles was officially terminated from the diplomatic corps, which came with a formal reprimand and an unofficial message from career diplomats calling him a hero. He found work as an independent consultant, helping negotiate trade agreements without the burden of institutional politics. Ilara remained with the mission, her resignation from royal duties becoming permanent. She and Miles rented adjacent quarters because protocol didn't matter anymore. But neighbors gossiped, and some things were worth maintaining mystery about. 6 months after the closing ceremonies, Miles woke to find Ilara already awake beside him, reading reports on her tablet. Morning light filtered through the porthole, catching silver in her hair. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Don't need to anymore," Ilara said, smiling. "Turns out I was just sleeping in the wrong place all along. Took you long enough to figure it out." She laughed and kissed him. And somewhere in the distance between stars, two people who'd found each other in darkness finally learned to exist in light. The nightmares still came sometimes, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. The end.